What's Wrong with Humans Now Cracks a Noble Heart. And so without further ado, and one more welcome to those of you who have just joined us, I will hand over to Andrew.
Thank you again, Josh, and welcome to all of you, wherever you happen to be sitting, as we engage together in this subject. No, I don't think anyone can be in doubt that there's something cracked and broken in the race of Homo sapiens. When we ask, what is a human, messed up has to be part of the answer. It's what the German philosopher Immanuel Kant referred to as the crooked timber of humanity. The crooked timber of humanity. Now, we opened the door a bit to this subject last week. We saw how the self, how humans function in time, and this actually reveals a very fragile self. I made the point that there's a void of self when it comes to being in the present moment. We're not there. And we live under the tyranny of time that has our death warrant written into it. Now, I think what comes as a shock, what should come as a shock, is when we observe just how crooked we are as humans. Now, of course, Christians have a reputation for always talking about this matter, that the sin issue. But it should be said that there are plenty outside of the church who say the same. They have the same message. There's something shocking about our crookedness. Sigmund Freud, the great modern pioneer of the human psyche, he had a very negative assessment of what a human is. He said this, or wrote this: "I have found little that is good about human beings on the whole. In my experience, most of them are trash, no matter whether they publicly subscribe to this or that ethical doctrine or to none at all. That is something that you cannot say aloud or perhaps even think." It's a pretty damning indictment. Now, I think perhaps the clearest path to seeing how warped humans can be is to look at the serial killer. Popular culture is obsessed with the mass murderer. We endlessly pour over their lives. Characters like Ted Bundy and Charles Manson. Think of the recent Netflix documentary, Making a Murder, about Stephen Avery. Now, these narratives are full of such horror and revulsion. These characters have committed deeds that are so terrible it almost defies belief, and yet we're fascinated by them. And it's worth asking why. Why are we fascinated by the serial killer? Well, I think we want to know what made them do such monstrous things. And the other question perhaps is this: are they different and alien from normal people, or actually are they one of us? Helen Morrison is a well-known forensic psychiatrist who's interviewed more than 80 serial killers. And in her memoir, My Life Among the Serial Killers, she writes, "They're so friendly and so kind and very solicitous at the beginning of our work together. They're charming, almost unbelievably so. Charismatic like a Cary Grant or a George Clooney. As in, they're one of us. I could connect with them." Now, Scott Bond, who's a sociologist and criminologist at Drew University, he believes that the appeal of the serial killer is that we know, those of us who look at them, that there's part of them in us and there's a part of us in them. Yes, they may be extreme in terms of the evil deeds they've committed, but we can relate to them. And Bond says they're almost like a catharsis for the worst of us, a lightning rod for our darkest thoughts, like the sin eaters in medieval times who would take away the sins of others and by so doing cleanse society. A lightning rod for our darkest thoughts. In the serial killer, alien, but like us, some of us in them. Interesting. Now, this dimension of our humanity, the fact that we're crooked timber, that something is bent out of shape about us, it can't be ignored. And it demands some kind of explanation or account. Now, in the opening talk of the series, if you were here with us, we looked at 3 accounts of what a human is. And it's up to each of these accounts to provide some kind of explanation for what's wrong with us. The 3 by way of reminder, the first I talked about was the software account, that what we are is socially conditioned. The second was what I call the hardware account. What we are is biologically determined. And the third is the Christian account that says what we are is the image of God. Now I want to look at these three accounts tonight and see how they explain the crooked timber, how they get to grips with what's wrong with us. Now I think it's important to see the starting point of each account when it comes to understanding humans. When it comes to the wrong in us, what's our default setting? Is our default setting good, turning bad, or are we depraved, becoming good? So here's where I want to begin. Now the software account, its beginning, its prolegomena goes like this. Humans are defaulted to the good. That is, we're innately good. That describes our condition, and it's certain factors that are external to us that make us go rogue. Now, this is common, and it has been throughout all of history. You can go back to the ancient Stoics who predated Plato, and they thought humans shared in the divine essence, and that made us great in reason and full of courage. And the Stoics almost ignored the human capacity for cruelty, seem to overlook our fundamental fragility. Now, this account that the human default is to the good, that's innately what we are, is actually the presupposition that undergirds secular humanism. Here's the worldview dominant in our culture that believes that humans are a sufficient foundation to build a civilization on. And we're sufficient because fundamentally, innately, we are good. Now, this view has its roots in the thinking of the Swiss-born philosopher Rousseau, who argued that humans are by nature good. And he said that you can see this in our special capacity for rationality, and especially in our freedom of action, our freedom of choice. Now, I think this default position, which belongs to the software, is all around us today. It's core to the self-belief movement, egoism, I call it. It's a kind of belief system that says, be true to who you are, because the real you is wonderful. So don't let anyone poison your self-belief into negativity, because you're good. The self-belief movement has given rise to thousands of inspirational sayings to undergird this positivity about who we are. Andre Gide, be faithful to that which exists within yourself. Be faithful to it because it's good. Now, this viewpoint is so ubiquitous today that the German philosopher Byung-Chul Han says that we live in a pleasant pact of coexistence. What's the pleasant pact? That we have to keep affirming each other, how wonderful we are. And this is so much a part of social media. You have to like the other. You have to put a thumbs up. This has to be ticking over to undergird the starting point, that our default is good. It's amazing. As Thomas Ligotti describes it, day by day, in every way, we're getting better and better. And then rather cynically, he says, positive illusions for positive persons. Now, this way of seeing ourselves might be good for self-esteem, but the question is, does it stand up to scrutiny? Is it an honest assessment of what we are? Now, I think there's no doubt that every human has lots of self-potential, but such positivity about all the good in us, I think, is radically out of alignment with the reality of what we are. The fact is, we inflict wrong on others willfully and repeatedly. There's something bent out of shape. We are a crooked timber. And there's something in us that refuses to admit that point, especially today. Now, there's a remarkable story set back in the Second World War period where this was exposed. It's a story that you can read about in a book by Langdon Gilkey. And the title of the book is Shantung Compound. I highly recommend it. It's a story about a Japanese prisoner of war camp for 2,000 foreign civilians. And unlike many of the Japanese prisoner of war camps, there's no torture here. left really to just run their own affairs. They're given limited food and they're crammed into a limited space. Now, Langdon, who's an academic, is appointed as one of the leaders of the camp, and he makes clear that he's an ardent humanist. And by that, he actually clarifies, I believe that humans are innately good. He's committed to that viewpoint. Now, as he observed human behavior in Shantung, this is absolutely shattered. I quote him, "One of the peculiar conceits of modern optimism, a conceit which I had fully shared, is the belief that in a time of crisis, the goodness of men comes forward. For some reason, we think that when there is little food or space among a community of people, they will be more rather than less apt to share with one another than in ordinary well-fed existence. Nothing indicates so clearly that the fixed belief in the innate goodness of humans as does this confidence that when the chips are down and we are revealed for what we really are, we will all be good to each other." Then he says, nothing could be so totally in error. And he describes his experience of Shantung as self-interest, which seemed almost omnipotent next to the weak claims of logic and fair play. He goes on, "The trouble with my new humanism, I found myself deciding, was not its confidence in human science and technology. It was rather its naive and unrealistic faith in the rationality and goodness of the men who wielded these instruments." Let me just give you a bit more of what he said. It's just so insightful. He said, "The most obvious dilemma had been the moral one. Men must be just, fair, and generous if a creative and stable society is to be possible at all. And yet apparently this is for us a supremely difficult, if not impossible task. How are we to understand ourselves? Why does such an obvious necessity seem so unattainable and even unnatural to our present nature? As in camp, I continue to find both the humanistic and the rigidly pietistic answers to these questions unsatisfactory." And he finishes, "Those humanists who insist that men are naturally wise and good enough to be moral seem to me to be continually refuted by the patent persistence of dangerous selfishness among people whose intentions were good." So, software starts with our default is to the good. We are innately good, but we have to question it. Does that stand up to scrutiny? The second we move to now is the hardware starting point. And this says our default, call it our state of nature, is to the bad. And we have to do everything we can to domesticate and improve on this matter. So it begins not in dreams of our goodness and innocence, but with a much darker note. In his book Leviathan, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes used this statement to describe our species. It's not very flattering. He says, "And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Now that's, as I say, not very complimentary, but such a viewpoint is the inescapable conclusion of naturalism. Everything that belongs to nature works by Tennyson's law, red in tooth and claw. As Richard Dawkins writes about such a naturalistic universe, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And asserts, the worldview of naturalism, humans are closed into that order. That describes us too. It's interesting that back in the 1800s, the great English naturalist Thomas Huxley hammered Rousseau's innate goodness as utter nonsense. He said, "It's absurd to believe that humans are good by nature. And that's because moral goodness doesn't exist as a category independent from nature. Nature is an amoral reality, and so too are humans. And as the default of nature is cruel and not kind, so too us. We are brutish." And that, of course, is what Hobbes asserted 2 centuries earlier. Hobbes didn't believe in the soul of a human or in the mind as separate from the body. He saw humans as essentially machines. And as machines, he said, we pursue our own self-interest relentlessly. And in that, he thought we were brutish. Here's how the novelist Joseph Conrad saw humans within the hardware account. Conrad says, to be part of the animal kingdom under the condition of this world is very well, but as soon as you know of your slavery, the pain, the anger, the strife, the tragedy begins. We can't return to nature because we're conscious, since we can't change our place in it. Our refuge is in stupidity. There is no morality, no knowledge, and no hope. There is only the consciousness of ourselves which drives us about a world that is always but a vain and floating appearance. So the hardware account makes brutishness our default. And for that reason, no one should be surprised by the dark side of humans. Now that leaves a matter of, well, how do you tame the beast? And that's actually what Leviathan is addressing. Leviathan is this legendary, ancient monster creature. And Hobbes argues that our brutish state of nature can only be tamed by the rule of an absolute sovereign to dominate and crush our brutishness. So he argues in Leviathan for the necessity of the strongest government possible, one which is omnipotent, one that can never be destroyed or divided, one that inspires fear in us. It doesn't make pacts with us, Hobbes says. It exercises its pure dominion of power on pain of death. That alone can tame brutishness. So, where the software account is convinced that humans are by nature good and therefore has to explain the rise of evil, well, what's wrong with us? The hardware account, beginning with this presupposition that humans by nature are bad, it has to explain where human kindness and goodness come from, because clearly we're not just brutish. To say that that's the complete story of humans is also false. It's not honesty. There is a nobility and goodness and kindness to human persons. Now, this is where we come to the Christian account. And this cuts across both the software and the hardware accounts. It rejects the romanticism of the software account that our default is to the good, and it's just environmental factors that make us go rogue. No, it says there's a real darkness in what a human is that can't just be explained away by our environment. But at the same time, it also rejects the hardware account that our default is to the nasty and brutish because that's our state of nature. No, says the Christian account, humans have this enchantment factor that takes us well beyond the brutish state of nature. So yes, we are capable of terrible cruelty and evil, but at the very same time, we have this capacity for goodness, beauty, and truth. Realities that naturalism and the hardware account can't even begin to explain. So that makes the Christian default position of what a human is right now in the present a paradoxical one. We are so noble and so broken simultaneously. Back in the 11th century, St. Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, gave a description of humans that resembled a ruined palace. And then last century, the Christian thinker Francis Schaeffer described humans as glorious ruins, ruined palaces, glorious ruins. There's a picture of one right there. So it's so obvious if you look at what a human is that we're ruined, we're a mess, something is terribly wrong. But in the ruins is clear evidence of our nobility. And this factor about us still shines through. I think you can see this clearly reflected in Diego Maradona, who died this past week. He is the mixture, the clear mixture of both, as we all are, but it stands out very strongly in some. On the one hand, he's a footballing palace. He provided a spectacle of theater that wowed the worlds. He was also known for his kindness. He came from ordinary roots, and he actually, much of his fortune went to people who were in need. And yet this same person is an utter wreck of a human. Cocaine addict, a serial adulterer, uncouth, one could go on. So combined, Maradona was a ruined palace. And it's exactly the same with every human. There's such glory, such enchantment, and simultaneously such brokenness and such ruin. And neither side of this paradox can be exaggerated too much, as long as we push out both together. So it's not really possible to overstate our nobility, even as it's not really possible to overstate our ruin, how cracked we are. So Christianity's default position on what a human is that we are great enigmas. And no one championed this more than the great Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher we've referred to a few times. The human enigma was his endless fascination. Here's what he said. What sort of a freak then is man? How novel, how monstrous, how chaotic, how paradoxical, how prodigious. Judge of all things, feeble earthworm. Repository of truth, sink of doubt and error. The glory and refuse of the universe. Glory, garbage, ruined palace. And even when Pascal focuses on the dark side of humanness, it was for him the wretchedness of a great lord, the wretchedness of a dispossessed king. So even our wretchedness reflects our glory, our enchantment. And not even the worst in a human can remove this nobility. It's still there in the serial killer. So a coherent anthropology has to offer an explanation for both of these. And Pascal really makes this point over and over. Man's greatness and wretchedness are so evident that the true religion, or we could say the true philosophy, must necessarily teach us that there is in man some great principle of greatness and some great principle of wretchedness. We have to account for both sides. And as Douglas Grotius writes of Pascal, in surveying human philosophies and non-Christian religions, Pascal notes that they either exalt humans at the expense of taking seriously their weakness, or reduce humans to nothing at the expense of their significance. So the software account, on which rests secular humanism, doesn't take seriously enough our wretchedness. And the hardware account, naturalism, doesn't take seriously enough our significance. But the genius of the Christian perspective is that it explains both our enchantedness and our wretchedness without exalting one above the other. Now, it can do that because our enchantment is rooted and grounded in being the imago Dei, the image of God. We were created great by a God who himself is good and great, has goodness and greatness beyond our comprehension. Now that's a universe away from Hobbes with his nasty and brutish assessment. And these talks, many of them have been an argument for this version, that we're special and not ultimately of nature. But we're not only good and great and enchanted. Humans also have this crooked timber side. And the Bible says this is the result of a fall which was away from our original uncorrupted condition. So here's where the ruin dimension comes in. And the Bible makes very clear this is incredibly impactful in terms of how it's touched us and corrupted us. But the ruinous side of our humanness never cancels out the enchanted side. That's the point. We are both, and hence why humans are such enigmas. We are ruined palaces. Now, if that uncovers the starting point of the three accounts, I want to move on now to see how each actually explains the phenomena of what's wrong with us, why and how we're bent and crooked. So let me start with the software explanation. The default is that we are innately good. We've just covered that. And it's something in the external environment that disorders us. Now, what's wrong with us is due to something being badly constructed by our social conditioning. So it's the problem out there in the environment that's messed with our programming. Innately good, but The social conditioning has messed with us. So in the famous or infamous nature-nurture debate, the explanation for what's wrong with us is very much weighted to the nurture side. The reason I have an eating disorder, or the reason why I'm an alcoholic, or the reason I have anger issues is because of the home environment I grew up in. So the blame for it is on the nurture side, what's external to us. Now, it's important to see that the modern software account today takes it well beyond the home environment. And again, this viewpoint goes back to the 18th century and back to Rousseau. We've already seen that Rousseau believes in the innate goodness of humans. And in his discourse on the origins of inequality, Rousseau argues that humans in their original state of nature weren't sinful. They existed in a state of innocence. So what's the reason for the state of innocence? Well, Rousseau says it's because there was no society. So Rousseau argues that pre-society humans didn't feel things like greed and envy. Their only natural emotion was pity for the suffering of others. It was only kindness. This is known as his noble savage theory. And that's why for Rousseau, what went wrong with humans was the discovery of society. Because this social setting creates sets of rules and injunctions that deeply damage us. They cause us to misfire. So it's society that makes us bad. Now, this viewpoint has a very, very long reach. And I think it determines much of the current approach to what's wrong with us, what we see all around us today. It begins with the theories of Antonio Francesco Gramsci. Gramsci is an Italian Marxist philosopher and the inventor of what's known as cultural Marxism. You see the same kind of approach in the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Foucault looks at how power and knowledge works, and how they're used as social control through various societal institutions. And then you also see the idea that society makes us bad in the Frankfurt School. These are the inventors of what's known as critical theory. Now, what each of these offers is unique in terms of their argument, but there's a common thread. And the common thread is that the ruin of humanity is due to the social rule of those who have power. They make us bad. So this is the dominance. This is the viewpoint today of those who were white, those who were male, those who were heterosexual, and those who were able-bodied. These are the ones who control the social institutions, and these are the ones who misuse their power over those who are not like them. So the use of the power is always at the expense of minority groups. And these minority groups are the oppressed and the enslaved, the victims of this dominance. Women, people of color, non-heterosexuals, and today those who transcend gender, the transgender movement. So this ideology has become the lens for understanding what's wrong. And exposing evil means seeing through this web of society that we were born into. Because this social web conspires against our goodness. It keeps the minority silent. It keeps the minority passive to the evil. So our resistance must be speaking out. We have to stop being silent. This is very much the rhetoric behind Black Lives Matters. So because society is the cause of evil, back to Rousseau, our task is to deconstruct its web of evil. There you see it. Humans, naturally good, innately good, but external social factors mess it up. And as Douglas Murray reminds us in his book, The Madness of Crowds, this is a commitment that makes absolutely everything political. Absolutely everything he says should be made political. He's reflecting on this movement. In order to fix the problem, fix what's wrong, we have to make it political. So here we get into identity politics. Now, this makes what's wrong with us a victim narrative. We are victims of oppression. If we're in the minority, we've been oppressed by the evil webs of society. And if we happen to be white and male, we are victims of how we've colluded in a system which was handed down to us by a previous generation. So that's a software explanation for how and why we're bent out of shape. Innately good, but society has made us bad. Society is the problem of what's wrong, for what's wrong in the world. Right, the second one is the hardware explanation for how and why we're bent out of shape. And this says what's wrong with us is due to a misfiring in our biology. This is the case that Steven Pinker makes in his book, The Blank Slate. The causes of behavior are inside the organism rather than out in the world. And boy, does he hammer this home in his book. So here's the argument for what's wrong that moves from nurture, our environment, to nature. So what's wrong with us has a physiological cause. It's very much in the realm of a materialistic explanation for the crooked timber. So whatever is bent out of shape in me is how nature and biology has determined me. It's just the way I'm hardwired. It's in my genes. It's in my neurology. We can think here of Richard Dawkins' famous selfish gene argument. We are hardwired to choose for self-interest, to promote our in-house gene pool. That's our state of nature, to function under the selfish gene. Recent work in biology has focused on what they call the aggression gene. And this is why some people are more genetically predisposed to anger than others are. It's in our genetics, rooted in our biology. You even see the hardware explanation functioning today when it comes to explaining the behavior of bad people, of psychopaths. We look for the explanation in the hard wiring. As Yuval Harari puts it in his book, Homo Deus. He says, today when scholars ask why a man drew a knife and stabbed someone to death, answering because he chose to doesn't cut the mustard. Instead, geneticists and brain scientists provide a much more detailed answer. He did it due to such and such electrochemical processes in the brain that were shaped by a particular genetic makeup, which in turn reflect ancient evolutionary pressures coupled with chance mutations. How do we explain murder? Through a physiological explanation or hardware account. Now, this kind of explanation for how and why we do bad things reduces what's wrong with us to a disease. And it's quite common today to hear things like adultery, sex addiction, anger management issues labeled like this. It's my disease. It's not the wrong ideas, it's the disease I'm inflicted with. And because what's wrong with us is seen as disease, the cure for it is medicalized. So it's treated with pharmaceuticals or with a certain kind of therapy to treat the disease behavior. Now here again, the explanation of how and why we're crooked timber is really a victim narrative. My problem, my anger, my adultery, my addiction is due to my biology. And that's been predetermined. I don't have much control over it. So I'm a victim of my nature, my state of nature. Now, as convenient as this may be for us to label it like this, it's hard not to see it becoming what Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, referred to as the banality of evil. She looked specifically at Hitler and the slaughter of 6 million Jews. How do we account for a scale of evil like that? Do we account for that kind of evil due to a misfiring of our genetic side or our neurology? Well, to do that, I think, is extremely dangerous. Whenever culture undermines the positive reality of evil, it's in peril. And this hardware account that what's wrong with us is written into our nature just makes us passive in the face of evil. It's just the way things are. But of course, we should never be passive about such things. And for me, it's another reason why naturalism as a worldview is utterly bankrupt when it comes to dealing with the evils of our world, because it just roots it in our nature, in Hobbes's nasty and brutish. It's just the way we're wired to be. Well, let's move on now to the Christian account for how and why we're bent out of shape. This is well summarized, as he does with so many things, by Shakespeare in his play Julius Caesar. Famous line, "The fault, dear Brute, is not in our stars, our fate, but in ourselves." That's where the fault is, in ourselves. So what's wrong with me is what I am. There's a famous story about G.K. Chesterton that illustrates this. It's a moment early in the 20th century. Chaos is unraveling all over the place. There's rumors of revolution and war. So everyone's sensing that the world's now become a dangerous place, and they're asking, what's wrong? And the London Times reputedly approached various public intellectuals to make their contribution to the discussion. And Chesterton sent a very brief letter, and it went like this: "Dear Sir, regarding your article, 'What is Wrong with the World?' I am, yours truly, G.K. Chesterton." So we are the problem. The problem is not ultimately due to social conditions, our environment, or to our brain chemistry. These are merely symptoms of what's wrong. They're very real and, of course, very damaging. You think of all the oppression that has been suffered by people of color. No one undermines that. But the true cause of what's wrong is much more serious than that, because the true cause is in us, and it's in all of us. So what's wrong with us gets to the very core of what we are as humans. So Kant's cricket timber is not in our biology. It's not in our social conditions. It's in ourself. The problem is at the core of our existence, and this brings it into the realm of spirit. We've seen in this series that spirit is what really qualifies us as humans, that we are ensouled creatures. So the problem of what's wrong goes to the core of what the Bible calls the heart of a human. And that's why our problem is so deeply a personal matter, not impersonal factors in the environment or impersonal factors in our biology. It's about us. It's about me. I am the problem. So there's a flaw at the very core of what makes us humans that keeps throwing up errors. Now, what is this flaw? Well, ironically, it's a problem that some atheist philosophers have named very well. It's what the 19th century Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zoff called a damning surplus of consciousness. That's the flaw. It flows from a damning surplus of consciousness. And Ernest Becker and Thomas Ligotti, both atheists, emphasize the same point in our century. So self-consciousness really is a problem, and it's a problem not because science can't explain it, but because there's far too much of it. And this is the flaw at the core, that we work, all of us, out of a self-inflation. Call it self-aggrandizement. And this aggrandizement of ourself is disproportionate, out of all proportion to what it's meant to be. So we have far too much self-awareness, and this fills the horizon of our outlook. Iris Murdoch describes this masterfully in her brilliant novel, The Sea, well worth a read. And this is a dialogue between two of the characters. We are such inward secret creatures and that inwardness is the most amazing thing about us, even more amazing than our reason. But we cannot just walk into the cavern and look around. Most of what we think we know about our minds is pseudo-knowledge. We are all such shocking posers, so good at inflating the importance of what we think we value. Shocking posers inflating the importance of what we think we value. Now, the famous temptation narrative in Genesis 3 highlights this self-inflation, which is the flaw of us. And Genesis 3 records this fall of humans from their original state. It records how we fell into this state of becoming crooked timber. Let me read the passage, or the first 7 verses. Now the serpent was craftier than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die." "You will not die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Now, here it is. Here's the temptation to self-inflation. The temptation is, if you act for your own self-interest, you can become like God. You can expand your existence way beyond its present limitations. That's the temptation. And then the text shows up the greatest irony in all of human history. Because when Adam and Eve act out of their self-interest to become like God, we're told they realized they were naked. That's understatement. They have this awareness of the vulnerability of their existence. It's amplified. This is the damning surplus of self-consciousness. And it's that awareness that makes them self-aggrandize. So now everything is about us. So all of our problems flow from this damning surplus of self-consciousness. It's not our decaying biology that's killing us, it's our self-obsession. So we keep expanding our self-consciousness, so everything is about me. Now, we don't have much time to draw out the implications of this, but it's the cause of all our human insecurity and all the things that flow from our insecurity. It leads to the kind of awareness that demands the respect and recognition of others. We can't get enough likes. We can't get enough affirmation. And when this isn't forthcoming, our self-sense is wounded. And it's from this wound that comes our anger and our hatred. It could be an anger and hatred directed to ourselves, the one who hasn't been given what we demand. And all kinds of carnage can flow from that, self-loathing, even to the point of suicidal thoughts. Or it can be a loathing and demonization of the other human, which can come to the point of violence and even murder. Now, it's this self-expansion at the core of us that feeds our ambition. They become what Augustine calls selfish ambitions. So we act out of self-interest in our ambitions, and that means trampling on other people as we climb the ladder. And as Augustine kept stressing, it's the kind of aggrandizement that functions as self-love. And it's self-love that stands in the way of our loving others, ultimately of loving God. We were made to love him. But because of this damning surplus, the eye filling the horizon, we can no longer see properly. It's all about us. And the Bible says that makes us spiritually blind. We can't see others for who they are, and we can't love them therefore as they are, and neither can we do that to God. In fact, our self-aggrandizement is so great that naturally we are dead to God. The circuitry of our hearts has been rewired in self-interest to the degree that God interest has been obscured and obliterated. We are dead to him. So as we saw the other week, God calls us to himself through these longings he's put in us. And with that is the reminder that he is the center of all things, that in him all things hold together. But because of our self-aggrandizement, we block it out. We refuse this message, this reality. So really the state of nature isn't brutish, it's rebellious. It's in revolt against God. That's our natural condition. As Isaiah puts it in his famous prophecy, we all like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. That's self-expansion. And that's why our consciousness naturally has this built-in allergy to our creator. And that is the human calamity. Because this precious, fragile self that we are, it can only prosper when it finds its place, its home in him. Now, this revolt against God is what the Bible means when it uses the language sin. And this is the true description of our natural state. It's in rebellion against God. So much self-expansion, self-inflation, that we see ourselves as everything and see him as nothing. Now, this self-serving interest that we operate out of will never come to this conclusion on its own. We don't come to see this for ourselves. Part of being crooked timber is that all of us are self-deceived. It's actually part of the great human tragedy, that we operate with a level of self-interest where we can't really see what's wrong with us. We're blinded to ourselves. It's the amazing thing about humans. We can so clearly see the faults of others, but we're shamelessly unmindful of our own faults, of our own self-expansion. So part of what's wrong with us is that we're constantly lying to ourselves. That's Kierkegaard's great point over and over. Dostoevsky makes the same point in Notes from the Underground. Lying to ourselves is more deeply ingrained than lying to others. It's so much part of our wiring, the wiring not of our nature, but of our hearts. So not only is a refusal to own our self-expansion a problem, actually we justify it. We feel it to be righteous. It's something Langdon Gilkey observed in Shantung Compound. He said they did not decide to do things because it would be reasonable and moral to act in that way, but because that course of action suited their self-interest. And afterwards, they would find rational and moral reasons for what they had already determined to do. Humans are self-justifying creatures. We justify our self-aggrandizement. Now, this flaw at the core of us is so much our condition, and we're so locked and ingrained in it that only God's verdict and God's judgment on this condition can get through and expose it. We need a word of address from the outside to show us what we are. And that's why Pascal wrote these words. Know then, proud man, what a paradox you are to yourself. Be humble, impotent reason. Be silent, feeble nature. Learn that man infinitely transcends man. Hear from your master your true condition, which is unknown to you. Listen to God. So it's only when we listen to God, when we listen to his anthropology, what he knows to be true about our condition, that the lie about us is exposed. And then we know that I am the problem. The problem is in me, not in my genes, not in my neurology, not in my social environment. The problem is in me. I am bent out of shape. Now, to hear and to acknowledge that verdict is actually the path to life. And we're going to address that more next week. But the point is, we have to listen to God if it's going to get through to us the true nature of our problem, how and why we are like we are, crooked timber. Okay, let me leave it there. Over to you, Josh, and we can discuss it in a few minutes.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Andrew, for that wide-ranging discussion. We're going to go now to a 5-minute intermission. So feel free in that time to put some questions into the Q&A tab. You can also upvote other people's questions if you agree with them, think that they're good ones. And the other way to do that is to click on your own name and to raise your hand, and I can see that and then give you the mic in 5 minutes time. All right, we will be back at 2027, I make it. This is just a reminder that we will be having a virtual coffee after the last session in the series, which is next week. So I'm just putting the registration information for that virtual coffee there. We're painfully aware that this format doesn't really allow for a lot of interaction. So if you'd like to come along and discuss some of the subjects of the series, that's going to be on Saturday, December the 5th. If you like virtual coffee, there's going to be a whole lot of it around. And the link in the chat will take you to that event. Wonderful. We don't appear to have any questions as yet. So we will just mention next week's topic. Andrew, the topic for next week is A New Humanity, Abolition or Absolution. Can you give us a little taster of what you'll be talking about then?
Well, if this week looks at the problem, all three of these accounts have to come up with some kind of solution in terms of the fix, how humans can be made right. So that's what we're addressing. And philosophy and religion has addressed this matter through the ages. How can we put right what's wrong?
Absolutely. I certainly found tonight's presentation wonderfully informative. Can you say a few words, Andrew? Obviously, we live in a culture of radical autonomy. We emphasize authenticity as well. Philosophers like Charles Taylor have written on the ethics of authenticity, but where does that fit into your picture? I'm assuming that goes quite well with the software account of original innocence or basic human goodness. Is that where you'd put it?
Yes, in terms of our default begins as something good and real, and we just have to get back to that, to be true to who we are, to be authentic. So definitely, I think the way it plays itself out is it's core to modern secular humanism. In terms of the Christian account, I would say it's self-righteous. I am authentic. I'm going to be true to myself, and I'm going to be true to that no matter what anyone says. So it can often function as a kind of self-righteousness, or what Jonathan Haidt calls the righteous mind.
Of course, the quest for authenticity can be one of the most inauthentic things, of course, that we manifest.
Yes, I mean, it raises the question, can you be true to yourself? Because normally the idea of authenticity has a reference point which everything is measured against. So it used to be that your legal tender, your pound note, its authenticity was measured by an original. But to measure a pound note against a pound note is rather disingenuous. So true authenticity requires something beyond ourselves to be true to. Being true to yourself, I think is, I know what people mean by that. I'm not totally against it, but I think effectively it's completely flawed and impossible.
A couple of questions in. One from Anne Adams, who was just asking about the book, which is Shantung Compound by Langdon Gilkey. Is that correct, Andrew?
That's it. The title and author correct. It's available on Amazon. Not that I like to advertise Amazon. They don't need advertising, but it is there.
If you do use Amazon, you can go to Amazon Smile and you can select Christian Heritage as your charity of choice, if you don't mind it.
Yeah. I can't recommend the book too highly. It is a remarkable expose, and it's anecdotal. So he's telling in detail the story of the compound over the few years they were there. I'm sad that it's kind of drifted out of people's consciousness. When it came out, it made a big splash in the culture, but it needs to come back.
That theme is also explored in a few fictional works as well. The whole idea of a sort of separation from civilization and then a degeneration. Are there any that stand out for you, Andrew, in that genre?
It's an old film now, Mosquito Coast. starring Harrison Ford. He takes his family to West Africa to get away from contaminating society and to create the good life for his family. And it ends in utter disaster. The Beach, more recent film. Yeah, in a sense, the utopian dream of how we can recover our innocence is a big theme, and I'd say part of romanticism in its many phases. So Rousseau's noble savage, I think, keeps coming back in different guises.
With the Lord of the Flies figure in that as well?
Well, Lord of the Flies for me resonates quite a bit with Langdon Gilkey's work, that if you leave a group to themselves and expect good faith, it doesn't go like that. Yeah.
Anne's just asking about the spelling of that. So that's Langdon Gilkey. I've put the reference in the Q&A and also in the chat, Anne. So hopefully you can see it there. We've got another question from Jason Fletcher. How do you think we can speak positively into, for example, Black Lives Matter, while distancing ourselves from what might be a non-Christian anthropology by some in that movement?
Yeah, well, I think it's, for those of us who are Christians, it's imperative that we speak into it. We can't just ignore it and pretend it's not an issue. It's a massive issue. I think what we can quickly affirm is oppression. That throughout all of history, minorities have been oppressed, and it depends what a minority is. It doesn't have to be just Black minority, any minority. Christian minorities have been oppressed. They were under Rome, they are in many parts of the world today. So we affirm that there is oppression, and this oppression is wrong. For me, to say that this is where the anthropology is flawed for me, because it makes the center of our identities things like the color of our skin, our sexuality, and that's where critical theory for me goes so wrong. It's actually a diminishment of what we really are, and I think it's quite a disenchanted account, because it reduces us largely to biology. So we have to say we are much more than that, and it's the anthropology that undergirds these new movements, identity politics, which is where I have a problem. So much more could be said to that, but I think engage it and actually affirm where we see the wrong, where we see the evil, but actually be very, very careful not to buy into its flawed anthropology. And again, I think the victim narrative that it operates in is also very undermining of the fact of the G.K. Chesterton point, that actually all of us are the problem here. It's not just one group against another group. It makes our view of the world very tribal. And actually, I think it makes our view of social relationships incredibly cynical. So Foucault views everything through the prism of power, that all social relationships are power and corrupt power. Well, as tempted as I can be at times to think that might be true, it's not true. I don't think my mother and father did exercise raw power to disadvantage and oppress me, not for a moment. And I think you see in family, in local communities, many other rubrics in terms of human relationality that aren't just corrupt power. So I think that's also part of the critique of critical theory, which I just disavow. I think it's just too extreme.
Thank you, Andrew. Just a reminder to everyone, you can ask questions by raising your hand as well, if you're happy to have the microphone given to you. It's always nice to hear your voices, or you can use the Q&A tab. And we've got another question from an anonymous attendee this time. What do you think about the development of intelligent robots? Could this lead to an antichrist?
Thank you for that question. A very important one. And actually that is what I want to take up as part of my talk next week, as we think about how to redeem the problem I think AI and transhumanism are part of the attempt to for betterment, and within its own worldview, it's really trying to aim at something I think is hugely dangerous. But yeah, if you're able to come back next week, it's what I hope to address. And if I don't, ask me the question then. But I don't want to say too much more now, otherwise I'll give away my talk for next week.
There we are. It's a tantalizing hook for the final session next week in our series. Well, just making sure I haven't missed anyone's hand. No, I think that's it. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful to have you with us, and a particular I want to express particular gratitude to those who've made it every week. A number of names have popped up week after week, so thank you for sticking with us. Next week is 8 out of 8. It's the final session, A New Humanity, Abolition or Absolution. So it'll be wonderful to see you for the finale next week. And then don't forget the day after, Saturday the 5th of December. Wow, it's December already, isn't it? We'll be having a virtual coffee and Q&A. That will be interactive. So we'll be able to see you, which will be wonderful. You'll be able to see us, and we can have an exchange. So that'd be lovely. It's a bring your own coffee, unfortunately, as you would have guessed. But thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew, for a fascinating, stimulating talk. It's going to be rolling around my head this weekend as I process it. And we hope to see many of you next week. Thank you so much and have a wonderful week.
Yes. Farewell.